Welcome to our webinar, MedMasters webinar. This is our third one as MedMasters. As you know, many of you know us from previous business affiliates, but we are MedMasters now. We have begun this series on peptides, and then we're transitioning eventually into human cellular tissue products. And last week, or was it 2 weeks ago already, we had Lexi Yu on, and she was talking about peptides and other IV constituents also for aesthetics. And this week we've got Doug Rainey, who is, I just told him, I'm like, your knowledge base is something I have a tough time even grasping a few percentage points on, because he gets so technical, or can get so technical with the legalities and the sourcing of a lot of things. But in this case, we hope to really bring a lot of light to you for peptides. I think this has been a really popular response, or great response to this webinar, because of the topic. We know that the laws perceivably changed about September, October, and a lot of you had practices really centered around peptides. And so how to use them, or it's something you were completely interested in, and then it's like, well, where are we at now? And so how to use them, when to use them, all those things are there. But then, can we get them? Where do we get them? What are the rules in getting them? And then how do we even term it or use it maybe in some of our public facing materials or marketing? So Doug is super amazing at this, has been for a really long time, and I'm excited to have him here. Before we get started on that presentation, I just want to remind you all of some of the upcoming MedMasters events, and we'll talk about that in the end. But remember, we've got our membership, so you can have access to this information. By the way, I mean, we currently have ozone and UV and the things you know us by, but this will eventually end up being a vault that, as a member of MedMasters, you will be able to get access to all sorts of presentations and SOPs and marketing material and patient education on peptides. Also, we had our All Things Ozone virtual training course a few weeks ago. The recording is available to you, and you can go to medmasters.org at any time and see all of this. We've got our aesthetics, our live aesthetics course is with Lexi, you and I, in May 3rd and 4th. We have just a few spots left. So if you were ever considering how to do a natural aesthetics, both injectables and also IVs, that's going to be a fantastic place for you to not only get the education, but the business development, and you'll be able to see a full-fledged practice in operation. And it really gives you a vision for what natural aesthetics can do. And then we'll have a 2-day course on this peptide and human cellular tissue stuff come in early June, and I'll get back to that at the end. And then our webinar series next week will be Chase with body health, and I'll talk about that too, because he's an amino acid expert. And amino acids, Doug knows this too, plays such a role in peptides and branched chain, aspects, fat chain components. And so it just fits along with this. Plus, some of the side effects of some of these weight loss peptides are muscle loss, and that is definitely something we don't want to happen. So here we go with Doug. Again, thank you so much, Doug, for being here. He's had a rough travel week, and we had to postpone from yesterday to today, but so grateful he was able to find the energy to be here.
Thank you so much for having me, Kim. Yeah, apologies to everyone who signed up for this yesterday. I was circling Chicago and getting rerouted to Detroit. I can't think of two worse places. As a Packers fan, haha, had to go to that plug. No, in all seriousness, quick MedMasters support. I've known Kim for many years now. Started in the ozone world, but I've seen Kim present on everything from chelation to aesthetics, and she's phenomenal. Everybody she brings in is top notch. Not at all plugging myself here, but highly recommend everybody that is interested in finding a very kind of general path forward in everything that is regenerative, functional, integrative. Stick with MedMasters, everything that Kim and I have talked about the last 6 months. And sadly, I haven't had enough time to fully commit to, but we do have some plans together for some future trainings, protocols, live seminars, hopefully, because that's what I really miss doing. So Anyway, without any further ado, what do you think, Kim? Should I pull up the PowerPoint and get rolling?
Yeah, go ahead. And I'll just, while you do that, remind everybody, he's gonna present. We're gonna have this kind of structured that way, but please type your questions as we go into the chat. He can see them, I can see them. At the end of his presentation, we will make sure that those get answered. We know that you come into this with lots of questions, so use that chat feature.
Awesome. So as you can see, we are Project Y Biotech. This company is relatively new. A lot of you probably know me from Athletic Integrative Medicine, which is still my company as well. We have, I guess, bifurcated specifically to allow Project Y Biotech to be the sole company, customer-facing company, if you will, for our peptides. We don't want to be a jack of all trades, master of none. And frankly, as you'll see, there is just a tremendous amount to cover here. I'm going to get my face out of the way here. So quick disclaimer, obviously nothing we talk about today is intended to be legal advice. We're not trying to talk about any specific indications or applications for non-FDA approved products. And I am not an attorney. Please always consult your attorney for anything business related. Oops. Why are you not allowing me? There we go. So quick agenda. We're going to talk a lot about regulatory understanding. First and foremost, lab versus pharmacy. This is we as a lab, as a representative of a lab, we should say, oftentimes get these comments regarding what people are used to dealing with from the pharmacy side, because historically a lot of these folks just have not had access to a lab. Typically they're going through a pharmacy. So we'll talk a lot about that. There's a very good analog here to the regenerative medicine HCTP side. Won't spend a ton of time on it, but just want to present the analogy because I think a lot of people on here understand that world, and it will help them understand what we're trying to express in regards to the compliance and regulatory landscape. We'll talk about the difference between FDA approval and a physician's ability to use. Again, there will be a nice little analog there from the HCTP side. Of course, semaglutide is arguably the most popular peptide at the moment. It is the most popular drug of all time. So we will certainly talk about this. And of course, as Kim was alluding to, the category 2 migration, which was, this quote unquote change in regulation last year. It actually wasn't a change. It was a finalization of guidance, but we'll get into that. I do have some FAQs. We don't have to go through them. If you guys have a ton of questions in the chat, I'll probably skip the FAQ section. We'll have some additional points just to summarize what our lab does that's different in comparison to the pharmacy world. But again, we probably will have covered that by the end. So lab versus pharmacy, probably the most common question we get day to day. Having a drug manufacturing license is really the main thing that separates a lab from a pharmacy. So pharmacies have publicly available pharmacy license. You can look them up. They're state-based. We have an FDA drug manufacturing license, and I should back up. It is not Project Y Biotech. We are essentially the contracted sales, distribution, and logistics arm of the lab that has the drug manufacturing license. So we are not a lab. We're certainly not a pharmacy, but we've got some really nice relationships with this group that I actually met through my HCTP world. I won't go into that story, but it actually happened to be on the oncology side. So this lab has some really unique technologies, and their focal points being, I guess, originating in oncology, I think gives them a tremendous heads up in understanding a lot of the various potential drug interactions, even better application strategies, different ways to combine or compound the medications. Being a lab, they can compound, but they can also create. So this second bullet point here, creating and synthesizing peptides. It sounds like Chase is going to talk a little bit about amino acids next week or 2 weeks from now, whenever it is. Those are the building blocks of all of these products. And what we can do at this lab that is different than what a pharmacy can do is we can take single amino acid, single linker, so on and so forth, over and over again, until we've created this structure that becomes a peptide, aka a drug or a biologic, whatever you want to call it. That is not something that pharmaceutical licenses allow you to do. When you look at even the biggest names you can think of, Pfizer, et cetera, they have labs or they contract with labs that actually manufacture their products. So pharmacies just don't do this. For those of you that aren't familiar, the main difference between 503A and 503B is 503A is more about being having the capacity for patient-specific compounding. So whether that's simply changing dosing to be patient-specific or having some sort of alteration combination. There's a third word that they use, and I'm sure we'll pull it up. Whereas 503B is actually more along the lines of how our lab historically has functioned. Again, we're not a pharmacy, so I believe they actually have a 503B license, but they don't use it, mainly because they don't want the restrictions that come with 503B, and we'll talk about that in a second. But 503Bs are known as these bulk suppliers. So oftentimes they will supply other 503As. As a drug manufacturer, we can also supply 503Bs. So we can do both. But they don't have 503Bs do not have the ability to go patient specific. That's really the main thing you want to take home from this. As far as the regenerative medicine similarities, this was that analog I mentioned. I won't go too deep into this because in order to fully peel back the onion, we'd need an entire separate webinar here. But this document called 21 CFR 1271.10 was updated many, many times. Most people remember it from November of 17 because that was essentially when the FDA telegraphed their intention of having this discretionary period, allowing manufacturers to determine whether or not their products were or were not drugs. So were a drug being a 351, were not a drug being a 361. We don't have to get into the differences between these at the moment, but the reason that I bring this up is anyone that's familiar with this, age-old struggle that we've had on the HCTP side in not just determining where we fit into that category, but what you can do once you determine which category you're in. It's very much the same, I think, anyway. It's the same thing we should be considering on the peptide side. So, this next bullet point basically saying it doesn't really matter what type of drug you are. If you are a drug and you don't have pre-market approval, then you don't get the ability to make claims. You don't get the ability to market and advertise. You can't label for specific use cases. And some of you that have already used these types of products, especially from pharmacies, are probably scratching your heads thinking, well, that's weird because I definitely got labeled intents from our pharmacies. They would totally give me instruction. They would tell me what to do with it. We get these questions still today. It's actually one of the FAQs. Spoiler alert. What do I do with this? How do I apply it? How much do I use? Does it help with this type of condition? I heard this, I heard that. Those are things we really aren't supposed to be doing, and neither should pharmacies. There really isn't a scenario where a non-FDA approved anything should be able to have that type of labeling. And this is also a completely different conversation, just for anyone that's wondering, from the labeled for research use only, not for human use, not for veterinary use. You may have heard of some of these, some of them call themselves labs or pharmacies, but they're not. These are just marketing agencies on Instagram and some just on the internet, on Reddit, all over bodybuilding forums. These are companies, I don't want to give any names out, but a lot of you probably know who I'm talking about. These are completely different labeling restrictions. So those folks I wasn't really planning on talking about that today. That's anyone that understands even a basic amount regarding regulatory knows that you can't use anything that says research only in a human, period, end of story. It just can't be done. So you're putting a very significant onus on yourself as a practitioner by utilizing those products. So you don't want to do that, obviously. But what I'm suggesting is a lot more in line of what can you really do as far as, let's just say, promoting BPC 157 for tissue regeneration or for gut health or whatever you may want to talk about. Can you consult on that? Can you actually apply it for that? Can you put it in your notes? Whole different conversation compared to can you put on the website, right? So I won't go too deep into the the strategies as to how to function in this arena unless you guys want me to. So we'll wait for questions there, but I think those are pretty obvious answers. So again, I won't spend too much time on it here. This I won't read this whole page here, but if you can see the last bullet point, this was actually a really scary scenario. I bring this up again because this is why we should have FDA oversight. This is why the rest of the world has such a high respect for the United States. And they're all looking to utilize our products, even though most people are getting their raw from China, bringing it here, manufacturing it, Not always the case. Sometimes full API is coming from China, which I don't recommend, but the raw amino acids, even that our lab use, come from China. And I didn't like that at first because my understanding was that means it was manufactured there. That's not the same thing. It is 100% manufactured in the US. It's synthesized in the US. The excipients are brought from all sorts of different countries. A lot of them are from Germany. They're very, very high level. Whereas a lot of what you're getting in China, sadly, doesn't have anywhere near the same amount of oversight. They're mostly non-FDA registered facilities. They don't have CGMP over there. Most of them don't abide by USP 797, meaning they're not sterile. So those products are brought to the US non-sterile, and pharmacies are asked essentially to take that responsibility on and create a sterile product. So it's a very scary scenario when you start looking at the kind of the behind the scenes aspect of the pharmacy world. I bring up this bullet point here just because I'm going to say, more than 750 people in 20 different states developed fungal infections. 60 people died. Again, analog to HCTPs. If anybody remembers Livion, I don't mind bringing that up because I have to admit I worked for them, and luckily I never had any issues with the product. But there were several instances of people getting E. coli infections. This was a podcast, I believe, called Bad Batch. There was tons of documentation on this. I don't know if the outcome of or I should say the way that happened, I don't know if it was ever fully brought to light. But either way, that was, I think, 10 people and no one died. So it was the worst thing. That was the towers coming down in our industry, and it's the worst thing that happened. You look at what happened in the pharmacy world, and this is just in compounding. This has nothing to do with big pharma. Bottom line is there's a significant reason why we want to have regulation. As much as it sucks, it is super important. And when you look at what goes on in other countries, these are the types of things you'll see exponentially increased. All right. Understanding FDA approval. So this is definitely going to get into everybody talking about what we can and can't say versus what we can and can't do. As you can see, I focused here on semaglutide and tirzepatide just because these are such popular topics. Let's start at the bottom of the page where it says are compounded drugs approved by the FDA. These are all screenshots from the FDA's website, by the way. So compounded drugs are not FDA approved, period. I think everybody needs to understand that. This is something we get as pushback all the time with either the category 2 meds or even semaglutide in general. People will say, well, it's a lab, not a pharmacy. Pharmacies have FDA approved items. No, they don't. Anybody that says that has clearly not read the very basics on the FDA's website. As soon as you compound something, even if it has a portion of the product that was FDA approved, does not mean that it still has that same approval. Once you combine it, mix it, alter it, or make it patient specific, it wasn't what went through FDA clinical trials. Therefore, it's no longer approved. Now, does that matter? When it comes to a clinician's ability to utilize these products, it doesn't. This is in the same sentence here. They're saying that these drugs, and actually I'll forward on one more. Let's see. I know I had this on here. I'm going to go back for now. We'll find this. What I was going to show you is that actually, leave here it is. So the FDA is saying that while there are no approved compounded versions of these drugs, they're actually asking compound pharmacies to provide them during a time of drug shortage. And this is not even remotely close to the first time that this has happened. When there is a drug shortage, it is legal for compound pharmacies, labs, et cetera, for compounders, I should say, to be able to make these drugs. And the FDA asks for help. And it's actually ironic too, because there's still the interest of patent infringement. So there are still patents that are in existence. However, when there's a drug shortage, the FDA says, well, you can still compound those medications. So by definition, they can't possibly be FDA approved as soon as you get into that alteration state. So keep that in mind, and also try to use that as translational evidence when we get down the road talking about the HCTPs. they're realistically probably never going to be FDA approved, not for anything relevant anyways. Sidebar here, but cord blood was FDA approved in 2011 for revascularizing the immune system after leukemia. I know very, very few people that use it for that reason. I know very, very few people using cord blood at all because most people are using cord tissue now. But anyway, just as an example, keep those things in mind. I think this is a really commonly misunderstood aspect of what we're dealing with. So here's your definition of compounding. This, again, on the right side of the screen, this is on the FDA's website. So you can see what compounding means. It is regarded as a process of combining, mixing, or altering ingredients to create a medication tailored to the needs of an individual patient. So again, there's no scenario. Compounded drugs are not FDA approved, period. Again, you guys are starting to pick up on the fact that this doesn't matter. FDA approval is something that a lot of people have misunderstood for a long time. I'm not saying that it's not important to have FDA approval. That is not the point of this webinar. But it is very important to understand what you can and can't do with your license, and your license is not regulated by the FDA. Since we're on the topic of semaglutide and tirzepatide, it's important to just point out that the salt base, which is kind of hard to put out there because a base is actually what you're looking for. So base rather than salt. Anything that is salt created, so acetate and sodium formulations, are things that the FDA did have their own press release on. They made sure everyone knew that these are oftentimes, this is what you're going to get from China. They're extremely inexpensive, but they're dangerous. They don't have any really good supporting data behind them. Sometimes they don't characterize the active pharmaceutical ingredient correctly. There's a handful of things that went wrong with these salt formulations, but just keep that in mind. This is, I would argue, the most important question to ask of your provider or of your supplier, rather. If you're getting a compounded semaglutide or tirzepatide, is it a salt formulation? Obviously, the FDA suggests that you only obtain semaglutide from state licensed pharmacies or outsourcing facilities that are registered with the FDA. As you can imagine, super important. This part at the bottom, I throw this in just to let everybody know that, again, our lab, of course, historically has been a bulk fulfillment center, so outsourcing facility, as you see above. With that said, we provide to very, very, very few pharmacies. It used to be a lot more, but it's just not the main thing that we do anymore. And there are very few access points in the country. Which means it leaves kind of the big question. So where's everybody getting it? And it's almost for sure coming from China. So this API, meaning active pharmaceutical ingredient, that is almost always coming from China. I don't think there's anything else on this page we haven't touched on, so I'll jump forward. Again, we kind of just went over that. Has the FDA found illegally marketed semaglutide? Of course, there have been warning letters that have been public already. These are not just for manufacturers, by the way, because illegal marketing can come from physicians as well. This is where the FDA does step in. It doesn't have as much to do with what you're doing with it as it does with what you're saying. The FDA, among other things, but mainly when it comes to physicians, is concerned with making sure that there's not false information being perpetrated to the public. So, for example, if you have a compounded version of an FDA-approved drug, it's not FDA approved, and so making claims about what it does technically is illegal marketing. Of course, they found counterfeit Ozempic. This is different. This is not just saying illegal marketing. This is counterfeit. This is literally using the likeness of the word Ozempic. So that's a slightly different scenario, but equally, if not worse. Again, I think we've already gone over most of the issues here regarding the semaglutide. They talk a lot about the sodium aspect here. Healthcare professionals should know that working with a compounder that's FDA registered and all that good stuff is important. They abide by federal requirements. And then, of course, are they approved by the FDA? We know this. We've already talked about it. Before I move on, Kim, do you want to open the chat and answer any questions about semaglutide, tirzepatide? Because we'll move into the category 2 migration next. Is this a good time to pause?
Yeah, sure. I think only question in the chat so far is, when are non-FDA approved products considered experimental or not for human use?
So E&I, experimental and investigational, is actually an insurance term. That's not really an FDA thing. So E&I is more regarding insurance. For research use only, uh, you know, it's an interesting question, because there are instances where I think there are products. I'm trying to think of a good example for this. Let me think about this for a second. I don't believe that there is a scenario where there's a product that is technically labeled, label's not the right word, that's designated as research only. The labeling of research only is a designation that the manufacturer or relabeler, which technically is manufacturing in the eyes of the FDA. So when the manufacturer of a product writes or labels something as for research use only, that's when it becomes for research use only. And both the FDA and state health departments have determined that the definition of research only means it will never go into a human being. So it's not about like this compound is only for research purposes. That's not an actual, that's not a thing. That's not a designation. That doesn't happen. It's really, again, what the manufacturer's intent is for the product. Does that make sense?
I think so. Again, you talk so much over my head. Maybe I think so. Really, what's important is, does it make sense to the people listening? But I think so. Yeah, very interesting question, right? I think you hit on this, that so many people, including the public, right? Not just providers, but the public sometimes have a skewed perception of what the FDA can do, what it does do, what these terms mean. And it's why you're here. Like, there's very specific delineation between those. So research only is different than not for human use, right? Or maybe
It's
they're
really,
the same,
I think,
actually.
yeah, they're very much the same. So I think the confusion is that the FDA doesn't, they won't give something any indication or application or suggested use or non-use. They're not going to go out of their way to do that, because that's not their job. They would be the purveyors of an FDA clinical trial. And if you have an anticipated intended use, then you get into trial for that. The idea of something only being for research use is, again, that's something that would be what they consider manufacturers labeled intent. And so if you write that, then you are restricting it to only be used, essentially in a petri dish. It just doesn't have the ability to be used in a human.
Okay. Dr. Nario, hi. Always love seeing you. His question I actually wrote down as well. And I only know a little bit about this because I've had several conversations with pharmacies recently. I didn't realize this, but his question, statement, you mean that we get the products from China and the pharmacies sterilize it? And
Yep.
the word that I think you used was synthesized.
No, he's correct,
Different?
actually. So yeah, no,
Sterilized?
he's correct. Yeah. So a lot of these ex-US manufacturers of API, of active pharmaceutical ingredients, they don't have, so USP is actually a company. USP is not, it's a standard, but it's a company. It's not like it's not like CGMP, where you can get a certification for CGMP. USP 797 is, it's a sterility qualification, I suppose, that a company developed, and China doesn't recognize it. They don't have any. There's nothing over there for USP. So
So
I'm not
we're getting
saying.
the raw product from China, but then it's our job to sterilize it. But when that conversion happens from raw to sterilized, it actually, in some cases, maybe not in peptides is maybe where I'm confusing this, but it actually becomes synthetic.
So yeah, I think I know where you're getting confused here. I see what you're saying. So let's also delineate between raw. So
Okay.
purchasing raw aminos is different than purchasing an amino acid structure that then gets compounded and becomes you've heard of sterile processing, sterile compounding. That's a certification that a compound pharmacy can get, but not all of them have. Because honestly, most of them don't need it historically. That's not usually what they've done. This drug shortage has brought a really unique scenario where compound pharmacies now, if they're buying non-sterile, let's just call it GLP-1 receptor agonist, they're buying semaglutide from China, and then they need to turn it into something to avoid patent infringement. They're going to have to compound it. But if it's non-sterile, gosh, I really hope they have a sterile compounding facility. Right? Like that's a question you would want to ask. I think that's a very reasonable question to ask is my compound pharmacy properly qualified and certified to be doing what they need to do in order to receive API from another country? And then what does it come from? I'm not saying all of it comes non-sterile. It's certainly possible that some of it does, but I've talked to a lot of these pharmacies because they call us asking for bulk supply. And they're very open in telling us the reason, because frankly, we're more expensive, as you can imagine. I mean, stuff coming from China is a lot less expensive and it's made in larger quantities. And they own almost all of the resources for the raw. So we buy the raw from them, and then we do all of our synthesis here. So of course, everything we have is sterile derived.
Is it just sterility, or does it get into stability, potency,
Oh yeah,
endotoxins? Like
big time.
it's several categories there too, right? It's not just sterility.
Great point. Yeah, big time.
Okay.
I mean, and that's another. We can even talk about what's important to look at on a C of A, a certificate of analysis. Most of the things you'll see on the internet, like 99+% purity. Well, that's only one thing. That doesn't tell you endotoxin level. And God forbid you're using a product in someone that's already inflamed for some reason. Endotoxins are going to create essentially an anaphylactic response. So there's a lot of things you can talk about in terms of what's important on a safety test.
I
But
might be wrong about this, and I would love to have everybody chime in on this. And I know now we're kind of on a tangent, but this has been fairly new for me after attending hundreds of medical conferences. This is not the information you get. You get like, what is NAD? How does it work in the body? What are these protocols, etc. But did you know that NAD has been laced with endotoxins in many of our average or our industry's, common pharmacies? And this is where I was learning between methylene blue, between NAD, between Procaine. Like the pharmacy I love, you guys know this, Texas Star, she will not sell methylene blue right now because she says, I can't find a good enough, clean enough source that by the time I synthesize it or sterilize it, it meets my criteria. Yet other places are selling it. So it's the whole reason diving into this. And it's not just peptides, but I am just learning so much more about this and trying to find the right pharmacies, the right sources, et cetera, that are really keeping this clean, because the raw products do most likely come from China or not in a format that we would be able to utilize. So you guys might already know that already, but I feel like whether it's, again, methylene blue is so hot, NAD is so hot, peptides are so hot, and where you get them and what you know about your pharmacy or your lab is really critical. And I just don't think anybody's really talking about it. So anyway, Dr. Nario, thank you for that. Yes.
So I took this, let me get it out of my names way. So methylene blue from AK Scientific. This is where our labs gets ours from, and exact same concern that you had. This is, I believe they are Illinois based. But you're right. These things are really, really hard to find, and not just third-party testing, but in-house as well. They had an incident. I probably shouldn't put this on recording.
Okay, don't.
Anyway,
we don't want to get in trouble with anybody.
Well, yeah, what I was going to allude to is even the best companies, sometimes their products will show up with too much endotoxin. And if you, as a manufacturing facility, if you don't do your own testing and validate every single thing that you're using, even our excipients, everything that arrives at this lab gets tested, even though it shows up with testing. The owner of this lab, his name is Mike. He is I mean, he's an unbelievable scientist, but he's a psycho. And he will test everything. And if it doesn't come back, he'll get on the phone and he'll scream at these guys. And he's like, "Do you have any idea what would have happened if I put this in our product? You are at, you know." So not everybody does these things, I guess is really what I'm getting at.
And
I,
again, I would love to hear how many of you have been aware of like this endotoxin in NAD or methylene blue, et cetera. I mean, I get this question 100 times a day. Where do I get methylene blue? And part of the challenge here is those who are compounding are not happy with the resource. Doug, I think you just gave them a solution for getting methylene blue. And don't you do NAD also?
Of course. Yeah, that's probably outside of the weight loss, it's top product. We're getting ready to do an NAD BDNF alpha GPC combo as well, which I am super pumped about because it's going to be amazing for brain conditions. But yeah, we're going to do some really unique things here shortly. But that, just so you know, that methylene blue bottle is, I guess I should know the right terminology here, but it's like the raw. So you still have to make it. Sadly, that's not a source that you can just go on and call AK Scientific and be like, "Hey, I'm ready for methylene blue." It doesn't quite work that way. But it's super important to know, and we certainly don't mind sharing the sources that we use for these different components that are required to make these products.
Yeah, I might hook you up with Texas Star.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah, for sure.
back to the questions. We're gonna run out of time and that's okay.
Yeah.
I always try to keep it an hour, but of course, if this is working for everybody, happy to stay on it too. And if you have to leave, it's recorded. We will send you the recording. There were some questions about how to talk about this with patient stuff. I'm gonna come back to that, Stephen. Regina Smith asked, so compounded ivermectin, I believe, comes from a veterinarian source. I thought the same thing actually from COVID days, right? Too, with some pharmacies. So compounded ivermectin comes from a veterinarian source with some pharmacies. How does that take place?
I
Need to
I guess
get a veterinarian raw source and then convert it?
I'm actually not sure what the question is. She might just be giving a
Comment.
yeah, kind of a comment to let everyone know that this is another one of those examples where, look, ivermectin is, we know it's used all over the place and it's super safe and it's very effective and there's a lot of great things to say about it, but it's veterinary based. So it's I wonder if that came up when we were talking about the FDA clearance or FDA approval rather. Just that, keep in mind, with your medical license, you get to practice medicine. That's one of the great things about the country, right? So I assume maybe that's what the comment was about.
Okay.
And
Chris.
yeah, real fast, Melvin said, "Where did he get the methylene blue?" Just as a reminder to everybody, it's not like you can do it immediately out of AK Scientific, but that was where the raw part of the, probably shouldn't say the word raw because I don't know for a fact that's what it is. It's part of the probably pre-manufactured contents that our lab uses to then create methylene blue.
So you guys, this has been a huge project of mine, just coming from you guys, all these questions about where do we get this stuff. That's why I've been meeting with this pharmacies and this 797 compliance challenge, kind of again, getting off topic from peptides, but into the IV constituent sourcing, trying to figure this out. These laws have made everything so different for compounding. And I've got a couple pharmacists lined up to be on webinars. And I think we'll talk about it also at the 2-day course that we have coming up in June, but it has changed everything so significantly that the way that they have to test things, approve things, all these categories of testing before and then they have to have multiple prescriptions. Like, it's really made it difficult for them. And sourcing has been part of that because they have to test in more frequent batches. I mean, it's really significant in how it affects you, because I think many of you are experiencing it where even if you order some glutathione, it might be back ordered and then you might get it, weeks later. And then by the time you get it, you might have 2 days to use it. It
Right.
is significantly changing the landscape of IV therapy. So we'll work on that also. But in terms of sourcing, I still don't have great options for methylene blue, even though I've been working on this. So if you need that, write that into the chat. I will definitely reach out to you once I find those things, or if you know somebody who
I
you
will
feel
actually,
got a
I'll
good
cut you
source.
off real fast, Kim, because if you guys need methylene blue and we have enough
Okay.
people asking for it, we'll make it. That's honestly, that's the beautiful thing about having a drug manufacturing license. We can literally make anything. We just,
Oh, then go ahead and do that. Because yes, the answer is yes. Like
yeah, Okay.
It's very tough to get methylene blue right now. And a lot of things come and go like that. Procaine is another one. So I'm a huge Procaine fan. A lot of people haven't learned it, but that's what we're also teaching with Lexi in May because it's so fun and so inexpensive, but it's also hard to get. I know. So I've reached out to Vertisis. I've had conversations with them. I shouldn't say that. Anyway, they're a great pharmacy, but these laws have made things very difficult for them.
Yeah.
Texas Star, the only way that they're about 6 months ahead of everybody else that I've talked to because they kind of saw this coming and had things in preparation. But again, she has not been happy. She hasn't done any methylene blue because she's not happy with the sourcing. So I'll hook her up with you, Doug, and maybe that
Yeah.
is a way to even get it through at least the compounding pharmacy.
Sure.
New BioAge, I just met with them. He's going to be speaking to us as well, but yeah, so I don't see anybody saying pill form, yes, from Empower. Okay. Procaine, if you can get out of Texas, they're licensed in 42 states or so, and they can't sell to a nurse practitioner, but they can because that's Texas law. But they do have 2% Procaine. It's fantastic. And the reason I trust them so much is because of their top pharmacist over there. I've been with her for 15 years. So I know that she cares about this quality. In fact, I've had a glutathione conversation with her that is just so eye-opening. A lot of people are selling glutathione. It's oxidized most of the time on the shelf and not something you want to give your patients. You got to go look at how they're processing this. So anyway, Chris, how is your lab sourcing, Doug, API that is different from most companies in regards to contamination and country of origin?
First of all, mahalo, brother. I'm glad you're on. We've got people from the East Coast all the way out to Hawaii. That's pretty cool.
That is cool.
Yeah, it's super cool. So again, just so everybody is aware, sourcing API is different than sourcing the raw. So we're not sourcing API, and that's how it's different. So we're getting literally raw amino acids, and then we're synthesizing those into API. So we sell API. It's just sadly rare that people buy it from us because you can get it from China for so much cheaper. I hate to say it, but that is the main choke point is price and access. So until there are regulations in place that people seem to care about, when I say people, I mean pharmacies. There's probably going to be rare scenarios where we sell our API. Now we've been asked for it, but usually when the quote comes out, it doesn't get fulfilled. I'm not going to use this pharmacy's name, but it's a big pharmacy that I think probably most everybody will have heard of if I said their name. They came to visit our lab maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago, and their initial intention was to source about 10,000 vials of our 10 milligram semaglutide per month. They wanted to have like a routine source of it because, again, right now they're getting theirs from China. They're not happy with their source. And during their tour, they wound up finding out, this is actually a really good transition back to the PowerPoint. They found out that not only do we do all of these category 2 medications, which I'll get into in a second, but that their interpretation and their attorney's interpretation of the document, let me get my chat out of the way here. This one right here, the category 2 bulk substances nominated, blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but for those of you that haven't read this came out September 29th last year, and you probably saw all of your big name compound pharmacies release public statements saying that, due to the FDA's final guidance regarding bulk compounding substances for 503A and 503B pharmacies, something along the lines of, we're going to stop manufacturing these products, and by November 1st, we will either have sold all of our stock or not be selling, whichever comes first, something along those lines. I'm probably butchering that a little bit, but basically they made a commitment to follow this guidance by November 1st of last year. And so, as you can imagine, we as a drug manufacturer got a ton of these calls because, as you can see, this is very specific to 503A and 503B pharmacies. In fact, the FDA went so far as to link to the original guidance documents that were drawn up in January of 2017. I can't link because this is a screenshot here, but I can happily give everybody the links for this. They're very easy to find. And so, long story short, is because we're not a pharmacy, we do still have the capability to make these products. And that's really not what the FDA was saying. They were saying, again, we don't feel that we have enough information on these products to say that they're safe to be compounded bulk. And we're not. That's not what we're doing. We're not compounding them. We're simply just synthesizing amino acids into these products, and we're not making anything patient specific. We're not altering. We're not doing any of those things. So anyway, I think this is a really interesting sidebar conversation with the pharmacy that sent their C-suites to visit us, because they were thinking that, hey, this is a really great opportunity for us to access all of these products directly from you as what they called, I think he called it like consumer ready, something along those lines, basically meaning we're not buying the API. We're going to buy the completed product from you because that's how you make it. And we're not going to change it. We're not going to alter it. We're not compounding in any way because that's what the FDA specifically said we can't do. So this document is basically saying, hey, compound pharmacies, you can no longer compound these bulk substances. But if you read it with a fine-toothed lawyer's comb, it doesn't say you can't use them. It doesn't say you can't sell them. It doesn't say you can't make them or synthesize them, as you saw in this bullet point over here. So this is the reason, the whole reason we wanted to do this webinar was to debunk some of these myths and help you guys re-look at some of these guidance documents that, again, if you just follow, some of the Instagram influencers, everybody was jumping on this train immediately saying, oh my God, the FDA is outlawing peptides and they're coming for everything. Anybody that listens to Rogan, of course, is going to point to Brigham Bueller on the Ways to Well podcast, and he's saying the same thing, making it just seem like Chicken Little, the sky's falling. And look, I'm not saying this doesn't suck for compound pharmacies. It does. But it's not saying what people initially thought that it said. And this, for me, goes all the way back to the history of 21 CFR 1271 for HCTPs. It was the same thing. Guidance document was last updated November of 17. They gave us 3 years to figure out what we're doing. We got an additional 6 months in COVID. And next thing you know, the FDA said, all right, time's up. Nothing changed. It's just a final guidance. And that's the same thing with this document. These are just final guidances.
So fascinating that things haven't necessarily changed. They just became a little bit more brought to light and confirmed.
Right. Well, and it also would, I don't want to say beg the question, but it kind of explains how all of these compound pharmacies were kind of locked and loaded, ready with their response to that. My understanding, of course, we've talked to a handful of them, but ownership pretty much said, look, we knew this was coming. We just didn't know when. It doesn't surprise us. It's not fair. We don't like it, but it didn't surprise us. And I think a lot of people in this industry in general, because Kim and I were kind of having like a little prequel to this. Anything regulatory and compliance is in a fluid state. It's always updating and adjusting, and you've got different leaders in the industry providing different interpretations that people follow. So there's always going to somewhat be some fluidity here. You ask 3 different attorneys, you'll get 3 different opinions. So it's really hard for anybody to point to one thing and say, oh, here's the answer. They finally told me, in plain English, what I can and can't do. It's just not that easy. I think part of that's probably we're dealing with a government agency that wants the ability to change their interpretation as they need it, scenario to scenario. So take that for what it's worth. But yeah, end of the day is these things do have a lot more flexibility to them than you initially thought when you read each individual word in the guidance documents and try and define in that scenario what the word means. Super
I guess,
annoying.
and it kind of comes down to each businesses or business owners, in terms of labs and pharmacies and so on, their risk aversion status and their desire or ability to kind of find not the loopholes, but really, like you said, interpretation, how they interpret it, have their legal counsel get involved and say, this is our way forward. And so that also leads to some confusion because a lot of companies have landed in different spots with that. And it's like, well, shouldn't we know just black and white? Yeah.
You should, but you never will. You have to accept that. I always go back to my surgical days. Most of what was on the sterile table was not FDA approved or cleared, but that surgeon has the ability to make that choice. He or she is practicing medicine. You don't have to have approval in order to use these things. Now, do you increase your risk slash exposure? Potentially. Yeah, I think that's a reasonable thing to assume. Um, but I mean, another counterexample to that is we've now got a handful of companies. The first one I saw was Admiral, offering malpractice insurance for HCTP use and now peptides. So non-FDA approved biologics, almost every company that has had any longevity in the industry at all has had a warning letter where the FDA's come in and said, we don't approve of what you're doing. And they're like, okay, thanks for the letter. I'm going to keep doing it because you can't really shut us down. And people are still buying it and they're using it legally. You can't really do anything about that either. Again, I'm totally generalizing here. There are restrictions, but it's not what people think. And I think at the end of the day, you hit the nail on the head. It has more to do with what is your comfort with risk and understanding that, the majority of things that are being done in functional and integrative medicine right now are not FDA approved and they never will be. So these are not much different and you still need to abide by the same understanding. I think there was a question in the chat about, what can I say and write about these things? I don't know if you want to get to that now, Kim, or if we are a little late on time, or are there other things you want to cover?
I don't know if everybody's hanging on, we'll keep going, and it looks like they are. I'm good with time. Are you?
Oh, for sure. Yep.
Okay.
No flights for me.
Yeah, mine kind of going with Dr. Nario's ask also. And Dr. Nario, maybe clarify this. He says, is it safe by law for us clinicians to prescribe compounded GLPs? And by safe, I'm wondering what you mean there in terms of risk aversion and
Right.
like the legality of how I say it, how I talk about it, how I advertise it. Or are you talking about in terms of patient safety?
I'm so glad he asked this question. This is because this is a really, I actually meant to add this slide. I'm mad at myself now that I didn't. The understanding of the word prescription. Actually, looks like someone just kind of said something similar, thoughts surrounding legal script certification. Um, yeah. So yeah, save for our licenses. Right. Exactly, Doc.
Okay.
Dr. Nario. So yeah, let's talk about this because we get this question all the time about, oh, you can't work off of prescription, meaning you can't accept a prescription from a doctor because we're not a pharmacy. Let's explain why we even have prescriptions. What is a prescription? You, as a medical practitioner, do not need to self-prescribe. You don't have to, write a prescription just to practice medicine within your clinic. The reason you write a prescription is so that that patient can go pick up medication from a non-prescriber. So they're going to a pharmacy, getting from a pharmacist, hopefully, prescribed medication. Or in the case of a lot of our compound pharmacies in our industry, they're shipped, in like a lot of these 503A scenarios. That's basically the prescriptions allowing a non-prescriber to utilize a medical license temporarily to fulfill medication. So keep that in mind. It's not like you don't actually need a prescription to utilize these products. And it's very much the same with every other, think again of every other non-FDA approved item you use or non-FDA cleared device that you use. You don't need a prescription for it. That's, again, the beautiful part about your medical license. Now, compound pharmacies can't because they don't have a prescriber. They don't have NPIs, right? They're not actually a clinic. They're not able to send things out without, at least they shouldn't be, without that prescription. A caveat, of course, being 503B bulk scenario. So in the bulk scenario, again, we function as an outsourcing facility, very much the same way that a 503B does. We just don't utilize a 503B license.
So does the practitioner have to be licensed or the person purchasing from you? That doesn't mean the public could go straight to you, does it?
Absolutely not. And great question. Yeah, not at all. That is, we'd be in humongous trouble there. Really, that's probably the main difference with all of these, I guess you'd call them rogue pharmacy / labs on the internet. That's why you see labels of research use only, not for human use, not for veterinary use, all of those things. Fine, I wasn't going to do this. I'll throw out one company name, Peptide Sciences. I'm sure most people know who Peptide Sciences is by now. They have a really attractive website. They actually have a lot of great information on their website. But Peptide Sciences is not an actual lab. They're not a pharmacy. They have no registration. They have no certifications of any kind. I can't imagine that they actually make anything. I'm assuming it's essentially a marketing group that purchases from, again, probably China or something like that. Um, they actually have called our lab before. The owner and chief science officer has mentioned that to me before, that they've tried to call our lab and ask for products and, you know, say we'll do whatever we need to have you be our supplier, and he wouldn't touch them with a 10-foot pole for obvious reasons. But um, that's probably the main difference to throw out there in terms of prescription, rationale for prescription, and then understanding why, for the most part, in what we do anyways, you'll never need it. And Adam Berner said something I think this is very, very relatable. The FDA can regulate our lingo and claims, but can't tell us prescribers how to treat our patients, right? I think that's a very good summary. I've always summarized it as something like, the FDA can regulate how medicine is obtained, not how it's practiced. And again, there's a lot more to it than that, but as a very general understanding, it's just not what they do. That's why you have state-based medical license, and you've got Food and Drug Administration being a government federal agency.
So let's go one step further while we're here and say, in terms of lingo and claims, how do we talk about this? We can talk about certain things once the patient's in the office, very different than publishing anything, whether that be audio or, and Lexi talked about this a couple weeks ago in terms of human cellular tissue products. She called them, she gave some of the words that she uses when she talks about them online. She's a huge social media person, but okay, so how would we handle this so that the FDA is not going to come in and regulate anybody's practice? I mean,
Yeah,
they
it's
regulate it, but we don't want
interesting.
the X.
For sure. Oh, for sure. You know, the HCTP world's funny because I think a lot of people, a lot of the manufacturers anyways, have tried to come up with these words, like instead of saying
Yes.
exosomes, they'll say nanopods or something stupid like that, right? Like, don't say stem cell, say other thing that makes no sense. I personally don't believe that's the problem. There's nothing illegal about talking about stem cells. There's no reason you can't provide education about what they are, where they come from, studies that have shown what they've done. It's the problem becomes once you want to cross the bridge of, and come to Dr. Look's office if you want stem cells to treat A, B, and C, right? You can't do that. You can't simultaneously provide, agnostic information and then also have this, what do we call it? Like basically a sales pitch, right? As a term I usually use for this, but trying to get people to come into the office for that specific reason. Again, that's where the FDA bots are going to find you online, utilize those keywords. That's probably the main concern, is if you're trying to fly under the radar, don't use the words that are easily searchable. But I would argue the reality is almost every functional integrative person in the country is already being looked at. It's just way too easy for these agencies to do that. So everybody here is probably already flagged. That's not a concern. It shouldn't be a concerning thing anyway, as long as you're not doing any of those incorrect things. And the reality is usually you're going to get a little nastygram first. They don't immediately go out of their way to write you a warning letter. You'll get some sort of notice that's saying, hey, we looked at your website or your videos or your YouTube or whatever it is that you're doing, and you're making these claims about these disease states utilizing these products that don't have FDA approval. You can't do that. You've got 15 or 30 days to remove the content. It's usually something like that. So again, I'm not saying don't pay attention to the regulatory landscape, but weigh your risks. With that said, my normal suggestion is typically you should be doing symptomatic advertising, meaning let's talk about the patient population that you want coming into your office. And then once they're there, you can have handouts. You can certainly consult about anything you want to, but you can get a lot more granular about what it is that you have, how it works. Even your before and afters, right? Your explanations of what you've seen work, your anecdotes. I would be very cautious about putting any of that stuff on a website because it's way too easy to find. And by the letter of the law, it's illegal marketing. And it's different than having an illegal product, illegally marketing a product. You can illegally market an FDA approved product. If you're prescribing semaglutide for Parkinson's, yeah, you should absolutely get a warning letter. I mean, that's ridiculous. Hasn't been studied for that. So anyway.
So I feel like there's one step in this that I need you to clarify for me anyway. So there is education. We can talk about stem cells all day long, what they are, how they work, studies on them, etc. Then in the office, you can say, hey, for your current condition, I may recommend some stem cells. But can you say from your website, etc., we offer stem cells? Do you see that stop off point, like
I
transition?
do.
What
I
would you?
do. I mean, I
I have
think
a
you're,
client right now who just
yeah.
did this. They said, we do stem cells on their
Mhm.
website. And then they said, here's what stem cells are.
Where do you get them?
No claims,
Where
but
do you get the stem cells? Does it say?
uh-uh,
Good. So it could be bone marrow
I'm
then.
hoping from you.
But like in theory, it could be same day surgery, which is
Yeah,
legal. Yeah,
and
right. It could be. I'm just saying, like, if you really, that's really skirting the line, but in theory, it could be, if, and that would probably be one. I've seen letters like this where the FDA says, your website says this stuff, and it doesn't say to take it off, and it doesn't say you're doing anything wrong. It just says, here's all the links to all of the published information that we've put out, kind of warning people about what not to do. So it's like, you're not doing anything wrong, but you said the word stem cell and you're giving people information about stem cell. So it's not wrong yet, but just know we're looking at you. That's
yeah.
one of my doctors just got that letter not too long ago.
Hmm.
So there are versions of this. And I think, again, if you're under the assumption that you're already being looked at, it's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, because if you're under the impression you're not being looked at, you probably are just naive. If you're in this industry, that's just the reality of it these days. So I would just always advocate stop short of making claims. And sadly, that has to even go to claims of safety and efficacy, because that is part of clinical trial. Technically, you can't even say something is safe without at least getting through phase one. And typically, you're not allowed to make a claim until you're all the way through clinical trial anyway. Um, Unless, of course, there's an EUA that we won't talk about, but leave that alone.
So getting back to peptides on this, and we if we're gonna finish your slides, we gotta do it. But getting back to peptides, is peptides as big of a buzzword to the powers that be as stem cells are?
I won't say yes yet. I don't think so. And I can say very confidently, I have not yet seen an FDA warning letter for peptides. What I have seen is not just warning letters, but cease and desists for the use of the words semaglutide, tirzepatide, Wegovy, Ozempic, Manjaro, what probably will be what is it? Jetbound or Zepbound. Zepbound, the new auto injector for Eli Lilly. It's basically tirzepatide in an auto injector for weight loss. I think it's called Zepbound. So I haven't seen it for Zepbound because that just came out, but people illegally utilizing those names and likenesses. And that's, I would not doubt for a second that that was influenced by Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly calling the FDA and be like, hey, we pay your damn salary. What are you doing letting these people use our stuff? That's, I'm just not trying to be a conspiracy theorist here, but there's a reason that happened overnight immediately, where everything else seems to take a lot longer.
For anybody listening, I have in all this homework been able to meet and spend some time with an attorney who is a healthcare attorney in this field, believes in this medicine, practices for himself this way. And he has signed on to be one of our speakers for the event, this live event in early June. But if you are in need of some support, some legal guidance, he's not he's not in every state, but he's got ways to do that. I specifically asked that. But if you need consent forms, somebody to review your website, things like that from a true legal standpoint, let me know on that. Because that's definitely, you had it in your disclaimer to begin with, Doug, like you do need to find somebody who understands
Mm-hmm.
what all this means and can help you navigate like I say, in terms of your consent forms, in terms of your patient education stuff and so on and so forth. So excited, super excited to find him.
And without getting into anything personal here, I have had a very relevant experience with the need to have an attorney for this industry. And I had a 4-day crash course that I was giving to this attorney and his team to explain literally what stem cells are and how they work and what the regulatory aspects of this industry are. Just because that was what I was being sued for in so many things. There was a lot to it, but it's really hard to find. I mean, there are very, very few attorneys that fully understand this stuff, even these FDA attorneys. It's just rare. Most of the people in the FDA don't fully understand this stuff.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, it's
And
yeah.
well, and you guys know kind of some of the background with us and our previous company and how they are going through, well, the manufacturer of ozone or O3UV and going through this process of FDA approval and just looking at that, like there's so many people that have to get involved with how they understand or manage or interpret or counsel or consult on different aspects of this process. So again, I think it's a gold mine to find an attorney who doesn't just represent it, and he does everything, he can do everything from the like equipment manufacturer down to you as the clinician. And I secured him for our company because you always want somebody who not just knows it and understands it, but believes in like how this can benefit people, right? So I
Yep.
asked him if I could recommend him to clients because I don't want that to be a conflict of interest, and he said it's not. So I will get that to you.
We have a couple other questions, but I want to take Lewinsky's real fast because this is a really good one and it's very relevant. And it's actually relevant to another question above. He said, "What's your legal opinion about websites that simply list the peptides available?" So this would be the only other avenue that I would suggest if you're not going to do symptomatic advertising. So if you don't want to kind of like throw that fishing line out there and say, these are the patients that either I've got a ton of experience treating, or this is what our office focuses on, or whatever. If you don't want to do that and you just want to say, here's the menu, done. And then you stop and you say nothing else about what your menu may or may not do, right? You stop everything after that. Maybe you have a different section about your education, like literally your collegiate education. Just don't talk about anything regarding what the stuff does. I have no problem with that at all. I think that's a great idea. Because it's not saying anything specific about what those products are or what they do. So there's nothing wrong with just listing those. But I see your point after a telemed eval. So, if you're going to have all of your private conversations with the potential client, and then your website is more or less just for validation purposes, oh yeah, Dr. Lewinsky does actually have these types of things, as opposed to Dr. Lewinsky has, suggested that he's cured rheumatoid arthritis. Like don't do that. That's obviously not where we're going. um, there was another one up here about the regulations in regards to these influencers. We were kind of talking about that before. So
Yes, and
there's
I've
a lot
sent
of
you several of them too and been like, Doug, tell me what you think about this. Because I see them, I follow them, I know some of
right.
them, and I have purchased some of those peptides just to see how that all went down. And even
Mhm.
use some of them to be honest. And
Oh yeah.
it all just boggles me. But man, there's so much to the legal side of it to understand.
Right. No, agreed. I mean, I think so telemedicine in general has changed again after COVID. There were a lot of waivers during COVID that allowed a lot more of this stuff to go on that it just in most states it's not quite the same, quite as loose as it had been during COVID. But being able to review pre-ordered labs and advising clients on what to take without actually seeing them in person, yeah, it's legal. I mean, as long as you're operating within the guidelines of your license, that's really, again, it's much more important, I would say, than worrying about what type of advertising you're doing. Because if you're doing a telemed evaluation, it's still that's protected, right? So it's still your what's the term I'm looking for? Physician client privilege, I suppose. I think I'm using a term from attorneys, but it's very much the same thing. So you can say and should say everything, during that consult. Very much, I would argue the same thing with a consent form. Consent forms are not considered a form of advertisement. So a consent form is ironically a really great place to talk about everything that these products potentially could do. And I would argue that they should be somewhat patient specific, have a boilerplate, of course, that you start from, but the whole reason for a consent form is worst case scenario. God forbid you have to ever pull that thing out again. That's not something you ever want to have to do, but it gives you, in a way, a really good opportunity to, and I'll use the air quotes here, to close your client in consult. You present this consent form because on this form, it's going to talk about all of the things that I expect from you, all the things you expect from me, the potential outcomes that we've agreed on, the potential side effects, what you're going to do if and when you see those side effects, the rest of this program that you're committing to, right? Like it's kind of sign your name in blood, depending on what it is that you're doing. But, I was unfortunate enough to have spine surgery about a year and a half ago. And the amount of consent forms that I signed, I don't even know what I own anymore. I pretty much gave away everything that could ever be considered mine. And it was like, yeah, you may or may not wake up, but let's go ahead and do this thing. So this is not anything unique. Not that I'm suggesting having a surgical consent form, but it's a interesting way to, and I don't want to use this word sell, but more or less close in a way that you're explaining to your patients what the real expectations should be. Doctor-patient relationship. Thank you. That's exactly what I was looking for.
So much of this holds true. I get this question nonstop. Somebody asked me the other day, how do I market rectal insufflation? Because even the term rectal is just probably not something everybody wants to see on a website.
Put on Ben Greenfield's podcast. He'll do it for
yes, it's totally true, right? Which I told Ben I'm gonna send everybody to him just for that reason, because he's got no shame. He could just talk about it forever. But it's the same concepts of talking about what it is, how it works. If you can, I know a great friend of mine, practitioner in Oregon, where she links certain studies to everything, like right on the website, because then it's just educational, it's public information, and that alone allows a patient to start the process of thinking, oh, this is what this does. They might do something different. This might be something for me, and they will call. And then once they're in your office, you can really get into particulars. And as many of you know, I'm a huge fan of patient handouts and education forms, and that does print the information, but you're still going to do something very similar. Maybe, maybe just guidelines around it and what to expect, not claims.
I'll add to that. Actually, there was a gentleman, I'm trying to remember who this was, in Northern California that I worked with a long time ago. And one of his, I haven't been able to validate this with an attorney yet. I'd like to, but his kind of way around being able to, I'll put in air quotes here, make claims, but educate more specifically about the products that he sold at the time, was to put all of those anecdotes, the testimonies, linking to studies, all of that stuff, put it in a blog. And his rationale was, I didn't write it, even if he did. It's like, it wasn't me. It's a blog on my website. And so it's like an op-ed. Like nothing in a blog is determined to be factual. Again, you see what I'm saying? Like that was his suggestion. I was like, it's a really interesting thought. I'm not sure how that would be viewed legally, but very interesting.
I don't know if I should say his name because I don't want to misspeak, but do you remember the practitioner right out of COVID that published, or he put on his website, that he was having great results with ozone and a couple of other things in his parking lot out of Michigan?
Oh yeah, actually.
I spoke with him. I did a webinar with him.
Oh boy.
And his attorney said, write a book. That's first of all, they can't stop you from doing that.
Right. I think that was the same ideology.
Yes, that's what reminded me of it. I think that's the same concept. Like, if you're a website for the purpose of marketing and making claims, that's different than just sharing your experience as a physician, and the case results you've gotten. So.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we see testimonials all over the place, but you could certainly think of a scenario in which you would leverage a testimonial that in a way that's too obvious, in a way that certainly would be interpreted as you self-promoting. And then you can place that testimonial in another environment where it's not. and you remove any branding. You ask the patient to not use your name, your clinic name, any product name, et cetera, et cetera. Right. I think in those scenarios, I don't see how anyone would get in any trouble for that.
I'm gonna put this plug in here because it's always what I think. It's always what I believe. I've seen it work so many times. I am a fan of social media for this purpose. I hate social media. Never mind. But I realize it's a necessary evil. And there's lots of ways to publicly put your stuff out there. But the number one place to start is your current database. Start with the people who have already been patients. Email them. We've got some new services. We've got some new products. We've been to new conferences. If you've got this condition or this condition or this condition, we've got new solutions for you. They know you, they trust you. Invite them in, and then you can have that conversation with them. So start there. And then you have a lot less to worry about too with all this public perception of what you're saying and doing.
Could not agree more. That's symptomatic advertising. Totally agree.
And if you don't have an email list, start now.
Right.
Because if you want to sell a book, if you want to bring in a new doctor, anything you want to do, that is your golden ticket right there. So if your front desk is like, we're too busy, we can't ask for emails, we can't put them, change that now, because that is the easiest, cleanest place to market.
Agreed.
All right.
I'm pretty much out of slides here. This is just
Great.
Real quick overview on the difference with the lab that we use compared to most pharmacies. Again, I'm not saying none of them do USP 797 or have CGMP certificates, but none of them have drug manufacturing licenses, that's for sure. So they don't have this level of access with category 2s. We were 100% USA manufactured. This used to say same day shipping when paid by noon, but we are way too busy right now. So I changed that. If you can give us a couple days heads up, that would be appreciated. There are scenarios where we can do same day shipping, but I try to set realistic expectations. So we're slowly pushing that back. But we didn't talk about this actually, the expiration date requirement. This is another pretty common misunderstanding. Most labs, and I'll start with Novo Nordisk. Semaglutide has over 12 months stability data coming from Novo Nordisk, but you'll never see that because when it's distributed by a pharmacy, those are state-based requirements. So the pharmaceutical board in each state will determine the expiration opportunity, I suppose. And I know in California, I think it was 90 a long time ago. It's now 28. So you can imagine, I think you alluded to this earlier, Kim, with glutathione, how it can be really difficult to obtain something, in a reasonable time frame, and its manufacture date determines its expiration date. So it's really difficult. So anyway, I think we were putting 6 months on there just to not totally freak people out, but we have over a year of stability data. We also have another study. I don't know why they did this, but we tested it at 104 degrees. So like hot tub water, for 35 hours and still had over 90% viability.
I was waiting for you to pause, and this is going to be my question. Please tell me why they have to stay cold. How long they have to stay cold? What happens if they don't stay cold? Because they're darn expensive. And if you want to travel with them like I do, I'm like, how do you do this? And I needed to know some particulars on this. So that's fascinating.
All right. Give me 1 second. If you want to know how I travel with them, I'll show you.
I've messed with this and I'm not good at it. And I just came up with this idea of getting a water bottle, preloading them into a syringe, water bottle of some sort of like ice pack or something, not ice, because if you're flying, you can't then take the fluid, right? So, but if I could get it cold to the airport, dump the fluid or have some sort of ice pack, and then once I get in the airport, fill it again with ice, maybe that would work. But geez, it's a pain.
So shameless plug for Yeti. This is how I travel. Now I'm traveling hopefully way more than everyone else is. But to your point, I mean, even when I go to the lab, those guys are all using these products too, and they almost never refrigerate them. Now, we never tell people that, and for obvious reasons, you give people an inch, they take a mile. But unless you're storing this stuff long term, it actually is a lot more stable than is normally advertised. Sadly, the data isn't what the expiration dates are based off of. So
Is it sterility? I mean, if you like, that's what you worry about, right? It's becoming contaminated somehow, or is it just strength or
it is actually like breakdown of the molecules is what people are
yeah,
concerned
okay. So
about.
just
Now
less
it would
effective.
your concern when you mentioned sterility would be after it's opened and punctured. That's different, of course, right? So if you're actually, let's say you're pushing air in order to get negative pressure, right? To pull out, right? So you have now punctured the rubber stopper. That is different. Now it still doesn't change the fact that the stability data is the same. It's your chance of pushing some sort of bacteria that was in the air from your syringe that you pulled, right? That's still different. That you can't, I mean, you really can't have data
Yeah,
for.
yeah, that's
Yeah, but stability data is what it is.
okay. We haven't talked about the variety of peptides that you have that you work with. I think we had one question about, can we get BPC 157 from you? Can we get, some of these pharmacies have removed, or it's been very difficult.
Didn't
Do you want to, maybe we talked about it. Did I miss it? Did you want to,
no, we can definitely
like,
talk about
what
that.
peptides are available?
So let me answer.
Injectables, by the way, there's lots of ways to get gut tides.
Right. Right. Agreed. I'll answer this one first. So do you make estrogen, testosterone? We do not, because we do not have a DEA license. So we don't do any DEA related controlled substances. So that one we don't have. I know you mentioned Texas Star. I know they do that. I think most compound pharmacies do that. Um, those are all big for them. But yeah, so sadly, that's not something that we can carry. Yeah, so our BPC is combined with thymosin beta 4, mechanogrowth factor, also known as IGF-1EC, and KPV. So it's actually a four-pronged attack. It's a 5 milligram BPC, 2 milligram TB4, 1 milligram MGF, 1 milligram KPV. So it's a 9 milligram product. It's one of my personal favorites because you can use it sub-Q. Of course, this could be, for, like you mentioned, something gut related, but also just systemic inflammation reduction. But it can also be spot treated. So I will do this guy all the time because I've had a rotator cuff tear ever since I had a grade 5 AC separation. So you can spot treat. I mean, I think you would still argue that dosing strategies would be BPC based. So you wouldn't consider the full 9 milligram when you work through the dosing strategy. You think about it as a BPC product that has all these other awesome additives that are synergistic. So for example, if you wanted to do systemic and you were looking at doing 250 micrograms per sub-Q injection, that would be, we've got a 5 milligram. Let's say you're doing a 2 ml reconstitution because it does ship lyophilized. Now you're looking at a 10 unit shot. So you have 10 units every time. You've got 20 servings, 5 days on, 2 days off. Now you're at a month. Nice and easy.
Got it. Now you just tore into a whole new topic, but before you get there, because people are going to have to go and whatever else, what is the name of your lab? We want it to be educational, but of course you are a great resource. How can
So
they?
yeah, actually just reach out to us at Project Y Biotech because the lab information is actually something that we only disclose under NDA. And there's a really important reason for that. They actually utilize several different DBAs. They joke about this all the time, but they say we want to be everybody's best kept secret. They don't want phone calls. They don't want visits. They don't want any notoriety whatsoever. That was one of the reasons we got involved. So we're more than happy to share not just name, but also drug license and CGMP. So we can show it. I'm allowed to show it on Zoom, but it's not something that they want us handing out. Certainly not on a recorded webinar.
And just keep in mind, if you do need to go, or you want that information, we'll absolutely put the best way to contact Doug in the follow-up email, on the webinar or the replay, email. And also, if these peptides don't, like, you don't know what all these do and how to use them and how to, understand them and offer them in your practice, that is, again, what we will be doing in June, going back to each one of these peptides and how to understand them better and use them. So, getting on with the question at hand, mixing peptides.
Yep. That's actually, I'm doing a webinar, I think next week or the following week on something we call it stacking. So peptide stacking. Of course, you can imagine a lot of the interest in that conversation is based around doing like a weight loss product like semaglutide or tirzepatide, but then stacking with something anti-catabolic to
Yes.
prevent the breakdown. Something like maybe MOTS-c to increase cellular metabolism, something like a tesamorelin ipamorelin combo to have more of an anabolic effect, promote more muscle mass gain. It's like there's so many cool ways that you can make these more than just a weight loss drug. I think
I think you
focusing,
need to, because
yeah,
well, most likely, we've had this conversation, you and I, but I have so many people around me, both in practice and friends, et cetera, that went the weight loss route, but they did not properly stack them. And so they've lost hair, they've lost, this is the amino acid conversation too, but they've lost muscle mass.
yeah,
And I've got all sorts of, again, speakers on this because I think it's almost like a pandemic right now. My
agreed.
dad was on Ozempic for 8 months, and geez, he was unrecognizable, not just because he lost 60 pounds, but
Yeah.
oh, there's side effects that if you stack these properly, though, so you can use different peptides to mitigate or compound or stack, and I think it's required.
Eli Lilly feels the same way. That's why BGE 105 is in clinical trial, also known as azelaprag. It's an anti-catabolic. So, credit where it's due. They finally thought this through and probably learned from some of the early data from semaglutide. But like, you should know this. If you're going to reduce metabolic input, what will happen? Right? Like, I don't care if it's drug or just you're starving yourself to death on your own accord. The same thing happens. you know, it's if it was that easy to access stored fat for energy, we'd all be super lean and look awesome, but it's just not the way things work. So yeah, no, I agree.
And the lifestyle component also, I think that so what is really interesting, and what I've seen is, like, as you guys are probably seeing as well, is lots of people have done this telemedicine thing, find somebody that'll give them some GLP, take gobs of it, and then they've got these side effects because those places did not manage this well, not only in stacking, but also in proper lifestyle management, which how much protein are you eating, amino acids that you're taking, and then weight bearing exercise. And
Yep.
it needs to be such a comprehensive, holistic approach. So again, that'll be coming in June, but stacking and mixing. But to go back to mixing, do they interact with each other? Do they lose anything? I mean, clearly they don't if you're doing it, but how does that go?
They certainly can. It's a very important question, but there's a lot of data on the ones that we have and the amounts that we've mixed and those things. They are super stable the way that they are mixed. The other really interesting thing I can talk about with this lab, they have I'm trying to think of the right way to explain this without totally losing everybody. It's basically a patented delivery system that has an FDA approval. It is called hydroxybutyl propyl cyclodextrin. I think I
Oh,
butchered that a little bit, but yeah, it's a mouthful. So CD for short, cyclodextrin. It's a really unique sugar compound that encapsulates whatever drug that you want it to, and it improves the lifespan in the body. It allows for hepatic bypass. It can make it orally available. So almost anything that they make can become orally available. For example, even a Myers cocktail can be powdered and you can eat it and it absorbs right through the roof of the mouth. It actually has better brain access that way.
wow.
Yeah, really a ton of cool technology that these guys have. It's been so much fun hanging out with them and just getting to, like, have a few drinks and talk about just all the insane stuff that goes on in the lab every day. But anyway, this cyclodextrin, among other things, in the FDA approval, there was a document that I read from 2016 that talked about it actually breaks up cholesterol crystals. So it has this side benefit, not just delivering drugs correctly and extending lifespan, and therefore making it more stable in, even in a reconstituted state, and preventing interaction, which was part of the question. But it has this cool side benefit that it's got an FDA approval to reduce cholesterol crystals in arteries. So, I mean, you think about everybody as we all age, that becomes a problem for just about everybody. So just another really cool side benefit to everything they make.
I've learned of some cool stuff too. Again, stacking these speakers I don't have the link yet, because I haven't been able to confirm the final date, but it'll be early-ish June and you'll hear about it from us. But Leonard from New BioAge, he's going to be presenting at the peptide conference here in the next week or two. And then he's got AFRAM and he's all over the place. So if you're going to conferences this conference season, you might see him, but he's got some studies on cellular hydration and how that plays such a role in how these peptides are utilized, et cetera. So he's got some products that he'll be sharing with us also. So yeah, lots of ways to leverage, I think, not just one or two therapies or compounds or peptides, but even in the supplements, et cetera, that you use. So Dr. Conover, yes, I reached out to him. I haven't heard back in the last week or so, but multiple mixed combo peptides they stopped providing after the FDA notice. Yes.
I'm guessing September 29th guidance is my guess.
Yes.
Yep,
And I also reached out to him about methylene blue and NAD, and he's like, not right now. So doesn't mean we can't do it, and that's why Doug's here. But yeah, his whatever it was, however he decided it, his legal team, his interpretation of the law, his risk assessment, he confirmed that with me that he did. You're correct. He did stop selling.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Did everybody get their questions answered? You are doing C. Somebody asked that.
Yep.
I think you said
Certainly.
yes.
Yep.
Do you have GHK copper peptide?
We haven't made it in a while, but it's one that I'm asking for. That, so just so we know what's coming up next, GHKCU epitalon is on there. That's another one I personally really want. And then that NAD BDNF alpha GPC combo.
I don't know if you guys, how many of you might have been there, but I also did the first webinar as MedMaster that we did with Dr. John Harmon with these crystal patches that use your body's infrared light as a reaction to stimulate your own stem cell production, peptide production. He's got a GHK copper peptide book, etc. I've been wearing those patches 2 months or so. They're all over my neck right now. That's another interesting way to do this that's not oral. So that is on our YouTube channel, actually, if you're interested in learning about that. And we've had several practitioners sign up, get the patches given to patients, and we've had a super big influx of just these amazing clinical outcomes. Again, non-injectable. They're sold as a wellness device. And so this whole regulatory thing is almost completely irrelevant for them. And because they're a wellness device, they qualify just fine for professional athletes. So anyway, that's on our YouTube channel, and Lexi's will be there soon. Okay. I think we got the dosage is a concern for me, please.
There's one, this is actually an important one, the tesamorelin, ipamorelin. So this used to be CJC ipamorelin. One of the reasons we switched, I guess, to tesamorelin's FDA approved for anybody that cares. But tesamorelin is FDA approved for visceral adipose tissue reduction for AIDS and HIV patients. So again, pretty irrelevant for what anybody in here is going to be using it for. The reason I mention that, though, is because the study for that FDA approval was like 1 to 2 milligrams a day. It was a lot. It was a significant amount. Remember, highly compromised patient population. And the study was for something that we really aren't using tesamorelin for. It's a GHRH. So we're really not, like, a side benefit would be that, yes, when you have elevated growth hormone levels, you naturally are going to have a lot of at least like belly fat reduction. Like the visceral adipose tissue, I think, is a lot harder to access, but with those levels, certainly you would. When Linda is saying the dosage is a concern, I think this is where a lot of people get confused. They think they need this massive dose of tesamorelin because they're following that FDA guideline. That FDA guideline was not made for healthy populations that are looking to improve growth hormone release. You do not need a 1 to 2 milligram a day dose of tesamorelin. That's insane. So the normal recommendation that we are sitting at, just really for sake of even numbers, is about that 250 microgram per day, 5 on, 2 off, months worth per vial rather. And so we have 2.5 and 2.5. It's a 5 milligram total bottle. So 2.5 milligrams tesamorelin, 2.5 ipamorelin. So you're getting 125 micrograms of each per dose. And this is, again, in terms of what we've seen, it is more than sufficient. You can certainly do more, but like these are just signaling molecules. There's going to be a point of diminishing returns. And there's only going to be so much that your body can naturally manufacture. And that's always the argument. So when do you go exogenous versus endogenous? Or do you do both? That's a constant discussion in the TRT world. Do you do HCG simultaneously to your testosterone injections? Right. These are always conversations to have.
Yeah, so conversely to stacking, what about the cycling? Like, so let's say you're using a testosterone ipamorelin ratio, and then maybe the body stops responding to that, or you start to get into that area of diminishing return. Do then you switch to like,
A different growth
yeah,
hormone.
yeah,
Right. Yeah.
different peptide that could do a similar thing?
I've
Um,
I've certainly heard of that rationale. Yeah. I mean, like for example, ceramorelin is the one that most people know about. It has arguably the worst data. It's also FDA approved. But it's got the least effective data in comparison. But it's the most common. Most people still offer that, and I don't see any problem with it. You may need to use more, but these are, to your point, if these are all so GHRH versus GHRP, you've got slightly different receptors. Do you really want to overstimulate them? Is that the idea? I would argue that anybody that's doing these products is not going to be doing it for significant athletic improvements. It should be more for anti-aging and longevity. If you're looking for athletic improvements, go exogenous. That's the only way to get, what's the term that everyone uses? Not superficial, supra, another word I can't think of right now. I apologize. Excessive levels. Super physiologic. There it is. Couldn't think of that.
super, you may want to be, Linda just typed it.
There you go. Thanks, Linda.
Superhuman, Superman like performance.
It's in
Yeah.
there some.
Do you suggest measuring IGF-1 as a way of tracking the response to the peptides?
I mean, it's part of the cycle. I mean, it's essentially the byproduct, right? So potentially. I mean, that's actually another one that I'm surprised we don't have yet is IGF-1 LR3. I really, really, really want that personally. So that's another one I'm pushing for. But again, that would be taking it in a way that's taking it exogenously. We're not asking the body to make it by responding to increased growth hormone levels. So pros and cons, I would argue that you do shorter cycles of IGF-1 than a GHRH. And yeah, I am personally pushing for epitalon, Linda. So for sure is what I'm very interested in. Yeah, I'm not saying don't measure IGF-1. I'm not saying don't. It's just I think there are scenarios where you want to use them both together, and then you're going to want to be very purposeful in your cycle length. It wouldn't be something I would do for an extended period of time if you're adding IGF-1. But yeah, you can certainly measure IGF-1 to determine the effectiveness, not just of the product, but also of your system. I mean, if we're talking about the pituitary's ability, that's a good way to measure it.
I think somebody asked this way early on, and we didn't answer it, but in terms of cost, I mean, lots of practitioners, lots of the public feel like that's why they stick with the ones that they can get covered by insurance, and then they don't properly stack them, et cetera, because these other ones may not be. But for your products, how do they compare? I don't know if that's a right way to say it, but I don't know. How do you talk about the cost of these peptides through the lab?
You're saying in comparison to, again, arguably like the Chinese manufactured products?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, depending on the product, there are sometimes we're actually better priced. For example, I've seen our NAD there are some that are less, but I've certainly seen some that are more. It depends on the product. It's not all of our products that are more expensive, but certainly your testing data is very important. And then our explanation goes all the way into even the choices that are made for, again, things like excipients or any other item that you would pick, even certain filters. These very, very small micron filters are, a lot of them are back ordered right now. It is really hard to find some of the supplies needed to just do your normal stuff. Um, the
Mm.
type of lyophilizing machines that we use, there is every little step of the way. The chief science officer, I can't even do justice, because he's been doing this for 18 years. He could tell you every little choice that is made along the route and what else you could do and why he doesn't do those things. So these are the ways that you mitigate things like endotoxin level. You improve effectiveness of the product. So there's always going to be tiers. Not everybody is going to be interested in having the most well manufactured product, and I get that. But I think as you do these more and more and more, you'll appreciate it more. And sometimes it's difficult to appreciate why you're paying this much if you haven't used the lower end products.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's hard because costing more doesn't always mean a better product, but oftentimes
Agreed.
you're gonna have to
Yep.
charge more when you've got a better product or a cleaner product or you're using better, like you say, filters, et cetera, or they're just back ordered. And so it's
Right.
affecting the cost. So,
Or a
um,
US made product. It's just more expensive to do it all here. I see this one. Is there an age cutoff with peptides? I guess he's specifically asking regarding growth hormone. I don't know. I think that's an interesting thought because we certainly talk about that with testosterone. Um, I would argue the answer is probably yes. I don't know what that would be. And I also don't think that I can say for sure there's no guarantee. There is no actual age that we know of where all of a sudden it's not possible. We've seen people way older than they should be responding really well to things that they shouldn't be responding to. And vice versa. There are young, especially guys, who have destroyed themselves. And it's just hard to say. I don't think age is the only factor, but I think there are certainly many factors that can play into whether or not incentivizing endogenous production of anything is reasonable.
yeah, agreed. Although, man, I've been so impressed lately with some of these really well done, educated practitioners and PhDs, et cetera, putting out just bringing light to some of this new research on anti-aging, true anti-aging, meaning we can take a 70-year-old with these conditions, heart conditions, neurological conditions, whatever. And if we do these lifestyle changes, high intensity workouts, et cetera, then we can reverse it. And reverse it. And then you're like, man, if you were incorporating that and something like this, who's to say that, age is even relevant? But totally different topic, but
Right.
fascinating research that's coming out in terms of reversing aging.
Yep. Big time.
Um,
This conversation is awesome and it could go on forever.
yeah.
Um, I'm looking at Linda's response here about, under age 30, don't do a GH stimulant. I mean, just to play devil's advocate, technically most GH plummets after about age 15 because you don't need it anymore. Most people's natural growth is very diminished in your 20s. And by the time you're 30, yeah, it's probably a reasonable cutoff when it's almost irrelevant by the time you're 30. But does it necessarily make sense to wait until you're 30? I don't know. And what's the downside to doing it earlier? This everything that you do to your body has a trade-off. That's for sure. You know,
I'm
there's
not
no
gonna lie,
benefit.
I've used some in my daughter. Many of you have heard this. Last January, she broke her wrist. She's a high-level volleyball player. It's her right swinging wrist. And reached out to Lexi, did some other, we did several things, human cellular tissue products, ozone, peptides, whatever. Pulled out all the stops, basically. It's the luxury of being who we are. But gave her some BPC. She, works out hard, she plays hard, hours and hours on end, and soreness. Anyway, we used it, and she healed up phenomenally and months ahead of schedule. It is not something I've done with her long term or anything like that, but for that purpose, definitely felt very encouraged to use those types of things for her.
Yeah.
And she was 16 at the time.
Yeah. I mean, one of the most impressive studies I ever saw, and this is going to transition to the HCTP side, but ultimately, we're still talking signaling. That's really all that any of these products do. They're not engrafting; they're just signals. This was a Wharton's jelly injection into a wrist fracture for I want to say she was close to that same age, 15, 16, something like that, Olympic gymnast. And I believe it was pommel horse that she broke her wrist on. It was something like that. It was, awkward angle. And so it looked kind of like a boxer's fracture on the distal aspect of the radius. Anyway, it was like 2.5, 3 weeks later. And again, admittedly, we're talking about a 16-year-old who has amazing healing capacity anyway, but everyone was freaking out that you couldn't even see the fracture on x-ray after 3 weeks.
Yeah,
So those,
similar.
yeah, you're right.
So
So very
I would
similar.
argue this though. In fact, I'm working with a company called EcoLight, and they're doing bone density scanning. And their research, they're out of Italy. It's fascinating. And then I've started to see some things with some other people anyway, that, looking at bone density and looking at the health and ability, one of the orthopedic surgeons here in my area has now started to check every teenager that comes in with a broken arm for vitamin D levels, for calcium levels, et cetera, because they're not healing the way that they should. Bone density levels in those under 30 are not like they were 50 years ago. And yeah, it's a struggle, but we want to assume that these kids have this natural ability, but it's diminishing. It's diminishing with our lifestyles.
You don't play
All
outside in the sun
aspects.
anymore.
Yep.
You know,
Yep.
six
There, we're not
months.
working out in the fields. We're not eating those things, and kids can be worst of all. Mine
Right.
included, meaning mine know better and things are very regulated, but they're kids and they do what other kids do too. And so like I say, I opted for it because I didn't want to trust. She had a couple other symptoms, meaning like she's sensitive or has tendencies with cavitation, not cavitations, cavities, etc. And I'm like, I don't know that your bones are exactly where they could be. And it was my opportunity. Like, she was motivated there to get IVs, to do this stuff, because otherwise they don't want to do that, right? They don't want to get injections. They want to get IVs because they're not sick. Nothing's wrong. It was my opportunity to kind of build those levels. And so again, I think there's a time and place for everything, right? But
Yeah,
I think it worked out well for us.
that's great. Yeah, that's great. Maybe she'll be a practitioner one day.
Well, yeah, I taught her how to help me how to do IVs so I could get some help with that. She's got
Yeah.
syncope that's like, man, it's just funny how quick she goes down. But well, in terms of time and everything else, I think we better cut this at this point. Doug is going to be back with us to get much more into the particulars of human cellular tissue products. He's got great expertise there. He's going to be back April 16th, right? And in
Right.
between April 10th, that's when Chase Baldwin from Body Health is going to be here to really go through the amino acid. Again, these are building blocks for peptides. Peptides are amino acid chains lumped together. And so he's going to be here. It's not a digression, but it's a little bit backwards in terms of how to use and what are the benefits of peptides. So that'll be, and you can register for these all at once. So when we send out this replay, there will be another link and you can register for Chess April 10th, Chase April 10th, and then Doug will be back with us April 16th, and then we'll be in Indiana May 3rd and 4th, and then hoping early June, we will have this entire 2-day presentation. The legal will be here, the marketing will be here, the sourcing will be here, and then even the didactics and lecture portions of several different peptides. So putting together that course soon, and then that'll turn into a vault that you can have access to with your membership. So look for our emails. They will be coming out soon. We so appreciate you guys being here and sticking with us this long. It's fascinating conversation, exactly like I suspected it would be with Doug, and appreciate you as always, Doug. And we will definitely be getting you the information, you guys attending the information to get a hold of Doug.
Thank you so much for having me, Kim. It's always a pleasure. We should
Hey.
do this a lot more. Sorry for always being so busy, but let's do it more.
Well, we've got you April 16th at minimum, right? So we'll do
All
it.
right. Awesome.
You guys take care. Enjoy your evening.